Okay, so we're going to start looking at some things in economics today, without going through economic theories per se. It's too much for a course like this. Economic justice obviously is, it's a pretty important factor in everybody's lives, and we can see what we're going through now. A lot of decisions on who do we help. Um, Not that it has to be an either or, but you see in Congress there's a lot of discussions as to how much the businesses, the big business, that should be helped so that they can create work and then people have employment and then have steady incomes, or direct aid to individuals. So these things are always discussed, and they become part of justice just in the fact that we're trying to do the right thing, and people can disagree on what the right thing is to do, because most people in the end want the same thing. It's the means that we get, how to get there, which is usually the issue. But there's something else too that comes through all of this. So we're going to have almost like a little crash course in ethics for the first half of this, and then after that we'll move on directly to how it applies to economics. Let me ask you something. What do you think most people use as an ethical system to make decisions? Like when they want something, it could be that perhaps they, want to purchase something, or perhaps they want to acquire good grades. What do you think most people use as an ethical system? Like, how do they go about trying to determine what's the right thing to do?
I guess we have to look at the comparison between something that we want versus something that we need.
All right, yeah, that's a good point too. That's a psychological factor. And my wife always did that with my children when they were younger, and they would say, come on, take me to Turkey Hill or whatever. I need a slushie. My wife would make them frame it in a different way, right? Because it's fine to want things, but when you start counting wants as needs, we already get confused. Okay, so that's a good method. But even once you determine that it's something that you need, what ethical systems do you think? Well, let me ask you this: what ethical systems are anybody here really familiar with? Because we're gonna buzz through them today, because I think most people don't have a good grasp. What ethical systems do you think are popular in people's minds? And if you can't, name it, that's all right. All right, let's do this. Let me start out by just making this little proviso. There is no default system, right? So we can't assume that because we haven't spent time trying to define exactly how we work through ethical theories, that there is just some default position that we all can fall back on. Now, I do think that for most of us, there is somewhat of a default. We could distinguish between our wants and needs. We tend to try to get our those things that we need without hurting too many people, but we make that a priority. But that doesn't really, solve how we evaluate things. So when something is happening with the coronavirus right now, and we're trying to determine what is the best plan to move forward, we can't just simply be ultimately pragmatic, because we don't always know what the fallout is. It could be that and I'm making this up, the well intentions of the government to help everybody directly with aid doesn't really do what they're planning on doing. Perhaps it just gets absorbed into the economic system and doesn't really stimulate anything and leaves them right where they were in the beginning. It could be that you give stimulus packages to the big corporations and they wind up doing things other than what's intended with those. So that winds up not doing it. So, it's not enough to just want to do the right thing. We almost have to come and figure out exactly how will this play out and how will we evaluate it. And if we're going to say that we want to achieve X or Y because we think they're good, why are they good? So, in economics, has anybody heard of Adam Smith? Anybody? Okay. Adam Smith had this idea of an invisible hand. So this was back in the 1800s. The Wealth of Nations is his famous work, and it was this idea that there's these invisible market forces that sort of carry everybody's interest. If everybody's pursuing their self-interest, then there's the market forces that come to bear. So you can almost think in terms of laissez-faire capitalism. But the problem is that if we leave everything simply to market forces, we're going to find out that some people are just very good at manipulating them and taking advantage of them. So as we talk a little bit about this today, like my position is, I try my best to remain independent as though I'm registered. That doesn't mean I don't have strong opinions on certain economic policies. So I see well, if anybody ever read G.K. Chesterton, he talked about, he characterized big government and big business by two fictional names of Hudge and Grudge. And his whole point is that they're really the same. To have a big business, they're going to have the same type of powers that a big government would have. So on one political spectrum, you might have somebody who favors government intervention. In another section, you might have those that favor the free economy and letting them determine exactly how things progress. But G.K. Chesterton back in the early 1820s said they're really the same, right? So, we're not going to sit here and try to delineate our understandings of capitalism and socialism and try to differentiate that from, social democracies and, what exactly is the capitalism that we use? Is it a business economy or is it a laissez-faire? We're not going to get into all those discussions. We're going to try to just, get behind the personal reasoning, because my whole thrust in what I understand to be what's necessary going forward is who we are, right? So it's more important that we kind of affect and change ourselves as individuals, at least from my position, than we worry so much about changing everybody else. Okay, so first was Immanuel Kant. Okay, so the thing with Immanuel Kant was he's known for this ethical system as deontology. So what he wanted to do was not just simply like create rules and follow them. It was how about he went creating rules. First of all, he wanted an ethic that wasn't based on religion. He wanted an ethic based solely on rationality. So there's nothing dogmatic here. So he came up with this understanding of what he called the categorical imperative. Now, there's different expressions of that, but in a nutshell, what it says is that you can't really come up with a rule, like let's say a maxim, right, unless you can will everybody to have that. So and then once you realize everybody can have it, then you can call that a universal rule that everybody should follow. Lying is one of those things. He can't imagine that if he can make a case for himself to lie, then he's going to have to make the case for somebody else to lie. And at that point, society will fall down because there's nobody that will ever assert truth. Killing the innocent. There's a variety of, when you say categorical imperatives that he came up with, and he used those then to determine his ethical system. But, I wanted to do something before I got to that. And I think I mentioned this before, but I'm going to say it again. And then the reason is because I want to see how we can apply some of these things. Let me get the big screen up so I can see everybody. Did I mention in class about the Wells Fargo incident? Anybody? Okay, good. Because I teach a bunch of ethics courses. Sometimes I forget what room I'm in and who I spoke to about this. Because this came from 2016, 2017. So those who worked for Wells Fargo were encouraged to open up credit card accounts for customers. Now, you can see, like, if anybody that works in those industries knows the incentives there are to, create accounts. That's why we have telemarketers, right, trying to sell us credit cards. And when you guys graduate high school, they're going to flock around you like vultures. They're going to see you as potential future credit, right? So the upper echelon in Wells Fargo Bank had encouraged their employees to do this. And they said, but use your own home addresses as the listing information. That way, the people will never know. So, their idea is who's really going to get hurt here? People have incentives. We're opening up more credit cards. The people don't really need it unless they go and check their credit rating or scores. Maybe they'll never even show up, right? But they even went farther, and they started to create what we'd call like fraudulent accounts. So, there's also incentive for opening up other accounts, and they would sometimes even move legitimate money. Now, the person who owned these accounts never lost the money, but just opening up a new account and moving some money into the other made it look like, they were doing better. And then they also started to sell life and renter's insurance, fraudulently to these customers. without them knowing about it. Okay. Now, these were prudential life policies. So what happened was over at Prudential, there were a few people that had worked in that industry that started to recognize something didn't quite seem right with some of these Prudential insurance accounts that were coming out of Wells Fargo. And when they started to realize that this looks like something fraudulent is going on, they wanted to do the right thing. So let me ask you, and you have to turn your mics on here for the next couple of minutes. What do you think was the right thing for them to do? They've discovered some fraudulent actions going on at Wells Fargo. What do you think they should have done?
Put a stop to it.
What's that, Ryan?
Yeah.
What did you say? I didn't hear you.
Put a stop to it.
Okay, how would they put a stop to it? I mean, they can't like, make a phone call. They're not the king of the world, right? But that's okay. I mean, I get your point. But do you think like they should have went and told all their superiors or whoever was their, the next guy or next woman up?
Yeah.
Okay. So I want to see actual hands raised. Who would have been the people? First of all, let me just preface this. This Wells Fargo is a huge account. If you create problems here, you'd be costing Prudential a lot of loss of income. Okay. But there's obviously something, forget about the illegality of it. Okay. There's something ethically fraudulent going on here. So what I want to ask is, if you worked for Prudential and you were the people who saw this, you're the whistleblowers, would you go and tell your superiors about this, knowing that this could cause a rift between your company and Prudential? So if you're going to be the whistleblower, raise your hand. Lizzie, are you thinking or what? Okay. Those of us that raised our hands have all been fired. The three whistleblowers who, and by the way, let me say, did the right thing. They did exactly what they should have done ethically. They went to the superiors and they reported that what is happening down there is unethical, and they explained everything, and they were able to demonstrate it, right? But they were all fired for doing the right thing. Now, you can't fire a whistleblower, right? Because we know there's whistleblower laws. But you should also know that most states are right to work states. So when you go and get employed by a company, like if you're in Pennsylvania and you guys graduate and you're employed by a particular company in Pennsylvania, and they come into your office one day and say, you're fired, and they have a box in their hand and they have two security guards, and they say, would you please clean out your desk and leave the building? You might start like, what the hell? What did I do? They don't have to tell you anything. If you tell them, I'm not leaving until I'm fired, you can now be almost breaking the law yourself. In other words, in Pennsylvania, you do not have to be told why you're fired. So these whistleblowers, they weren't in Pennsylvania, but they're in a right to work state. So that's not the right phrase. That doesn't, you get my point. They're in a state where you can be summarily fired and you don't have to be told the reason for it. So what they were fired for, as they eventually came out, were for other reasons. But everybody knew why was it those three. Okay. So, how would Immanuel Kant then, what would he think of this particular situation, right? So he would have to ask himself, like, if you were going to be, I'm going to be a Kantian, and I'm going to start to use the deontology as my ethical principle. In other words, I'm going to say that there are things that everybody should do. And if we don't all do them, then it's not going to work. And they're imperatives, right? So categorical means everybody, and imperative means you have to do it. And here, he's going to say, look, you cannot allow these people to lie. This will destroy, fidelity and confidence and everything in the banking system and in the insurance industry, right? So Immanuel Kant would say those people did the right thing. So if that were an ethical system that you were able to develop, that would be a principle then that you can apply to our particular scenario, okay? Now, John Stuart Mill and another guy, Jeremy Bentham, they came up with this idea of utilitarianism. Now, utilitarianism is a consequentialist ethic, right? So what that means is you're only looking at the consequence. So we're not as concerned as how we get there as we are that we've achieved something good. Now, this isn't just crass, like I'm going to kill somebody because he has $10 in his pocket and therefore get the money. That would be a utilitarian ethic, but that's so crass, nobody'd really look at that here. John Stuart Mill basically understood consequentialism as the greater happiness for the greater good. So if I had to call a default ethic that most people follow, this is sort of it, right? Why is it that perhaps some people cheat on tests? Because, you think in the back of your head, okay, who am I really hurting here? Okay. I get, yeah, okay, maybe I'm skewing the results of the test, but so many people do it. And in the large scheme of affairs, does it really matter? So I'm going to get a better grade by doing this, and it's not going to adversely affect a lot of people. So the greater good for the greater happiness. That's a utilitarian ethic, right? John Stuart Mill, Jeremy Bentham probably wouldn't have too big of a deal of what these people, did. But here's something. Does anybody know of stores? It's Claire's. Does anybody know Claire's? I don't know if that's in a mall near any of you guys. It's one of those they're like one of those little corner stores that sell like makeup and jewelry and earrings and all that kind of stuff, right? So my daughter, when I don't know if she was in high school yet or just out of high school, she worked at the mall in the Claire store, and they would only ever put one person on. And you can imagine it has all these racks with tons of earrings and and scrunchie bracelets, just all the little gadget accessories, right? And she also had to do ear piercing. So if she's doing ear piercing, how can you possibly watch anything that's going on in the store, especially with one of these corner stores that had like the big openings on two sides? So people sometimes just cut through this, right? So the shoplifting was extraordinary, but they were not allowed to do anything. In other words, if she saw somebody shoplifting, she had to just let it go. She wasn't even told to report it. Their manager told them just at their store that the annual price tag on what was shoplifted every year was between $30,000 and $35,000. Now you're talking, $4 or $5 items. I mean, how many of these damn things must be stolen? So think of a person that walked into one of these stores, right? Well, first of all, she said, I can't imagine why don't they just hire two people, and then with two people, you could have one person doing ear piercing and one person watching it. And I said, because they've made an economic decision. Most people that are not employers only see their wage as the cost that goes to the employer, but there's so much else: taxes, workman's comp, other benefits and insurance and such. So even for a $12 an hour employee, you could be talking somewhere in the neighborhood of $25,000, $27,000 a year. So to put on another employee throughout the year, they're thinking, by time, how many, we can't just hire one. How many people are we going to hire in order to fill this position? It's just more cost effective to deal with the shoplifting, right? But think of the person who's doing this, right? They probably figure that I'm stealing, $7 worth of stuff, and this is a big store. They make a lot of money. They're not even going to miss it. Who cares? The lady's not even looking at me while I'm over here, right? So what I would say their default ethic is they're getting something out of this, and they don't really think they're hurting a lot of people. So that's, consequentialism. And although nobody has a default ethic, I would say that's pretty much it, right? You can even think of the toilet paper frenzy that went on. People are thinking, well, others will find a way to get their own. It'd be different if we're in a very small community and we see directly how our actions hurt somebody else, then we tend to treat things a little differently. But otherwise, we don't really see the effects that what we do has. So anyway, that's consequentialism. And they would obviously be perfectly fine. Now, Frederick Nietzsche, you probably heard some of these names, but you may not know much about what's behind them. Frederick Nietzsche had this understanding of these cultural attitudes that developed. So he had this theory on, and I'm giving this to you in a really condensed matter. He had this theory on like a slave-master relationship. In other words, the societal rules are really to benefit the slaves. And by slaves here, I don't mean, chattel slavery. I mean all of us that are just beholden to those people in power. So he thought that, people like princes and kings and people that have power, they don't really need a morality. They're free to do what they want, right? But the people who are not in power, the slaves, they can never control the masters. So the only way for them to do that is to have rules or laws put into place that are going, in some effect, constrain the masters per se, right? So Nietzsche probably would have looked at this and seen the upper echelon of maybe Prudential and also Wells Fargo as being in the master class, and they're not really susceptible to the same rules and conditions of those in the slave class. So I doubt that he'd have a huge problem with this. All right. Now maybe some of that falls into the way that we look at things in the world. Anyway, Karl Marx. If you are a young socialist, you should read Karl Marx. If you are a young capitalist, you should read Karl Marx. Okay, I'm a big fan of people actually reading things for themselves. I cannot stand the secondary information that goes out. Like I post so little on social media, but what I do post through all this COVID-19 is just raw data. Like, here's the raw data that comes from the World Health Organization. Here's the raw data that comes from this. In other words, let's stop trying to look at the middleman media, right? So with Karl Marx, without going into his particular policies with Engels and everything, he saw everything as a struggle of power. So there's a lot in our particular culture that we see today that comes from this. And it's a lot of that too with Michel Foucault, but there's this Marxian attitude that there's always a struggle for power between the the bourgeois society, right? Is going to be overtaken someday if the proletariat could just, rise up. Now that never really happened, but you still see that these struggles between whatever we throw into the lower class and the upper class are still there. So he just thought that the consumerism, and this is where you're going to find some sympathy even with Christian thought. So some of these things were actually Christian thoughts that I would say he co-opted. So you have to watch that you summarily dismiss or accept anybody based just on the kind of provisions they have in culture. But he thought that this consumerism kind of just sucks up the individual. So there's something to that. But he would see this entirely, the whole case with the banking system. He would just see them as totally exploitative. All right. So if that was an ethic that you built on class dialectics, then that's how you would form it. Now, from a Catholic point of view, and just one aspect of Catholic point of view, we've already talked about these natural inclinations, right? To do good and avoid evil, to pursue truth, relationality, procreation, education of our children, and such. So, you would have to start asking yourself, what are the goods that are within the human person, and how are those goods going to be satisfied by the ethic that I choose, right? So, this would almost be in line with a Kantian deontology. So sometimes different ethical systems can reach the same conclusions, but they do it from different means. And they won't always reach the same conclusions, which is why you can't just assume that they're both alike. So along with deontology, natural ethics would see this as a real aversion to truth. And they would see this as a societal breakdown, and something has to be done here. So, the first principle of morality under, Catholic and most Christian schemas is to do good and avoid evil. And that you should never do evil, that good may come from it. So even if somebody says, well, these people, wouldn't it be better if they just kept their mouth shut? They would keep their jobs for Prudential. Yes, but now you're doing evil by withholding truth so that good may become of it. So you're almost falling into a consequentialist attitude that way, okay? Although many people would try to save their skins in that particular situation. I do get it. Because these are real life dilemmas, right? So wherever you go and work, you're going to maybe want to be faced with such a large one like that, but you're still going to be faced with some very clear ethical decisions. There's no way around it. I don't know who, I don't even care if you're self-employed, you're still going to be faced with ethical decisions. So you're going to have to make a determination on how do you weigh this out. You have a family, you have a house, you have a mortgage, you have all these other things you need to take care of. Should I put this in jeopardy? I'm hoping you say yes. One of the other places that I teach, one of the students came up to me and shared how their father worked for a pharmaceutical company in Philadelphia. I won't go into the whole story, but basically that he was asked to do something illegal by getting samples out to particular physicians and stuff. He refused to do it. They really fought him on it. They backed off because he turned in his resignation and said, I'll be out within the year. So they let him go. This is only the last, 3 or 4 years. So the young person who came in behind him saw this as an opportunity to make some really sweet money because they were offered quite a financial incentive to do what this other guy wouldn't do. But what was under review was the FBI had all this under surveillance, and that person wound up doing 6 years in prison. Right. So now they were caught, but let's not pretend that all these people are caught. There's a lot of instances like that in all types of vocations, all types of situations that are done on a regular basis, but they'll never come to the light of day. And just because they don't come to the light of day doesn't make them ethical. But anyway, so something to think about. Now, proportionalism was kind of like the Catholic Church's reaction to consequentialism. So it's not just the end justifies the means, but you're going to weigh things out, right? So picture two scales, and you're going to start to say, like, what are all the good things that can come out of this, and what are all the bad things that can come out of this? And we're going to put them on the scales, and we're going to see which ones are which. Now, there's still deal breakers here. It's not everything, right? They're not going to put murder on one scale, and that's the deal breaker. But they're still going to try to weigh things out and say, is this better overall, right? So this came out of like Catholic moral theology of the 60s and 70s. It's been denounced pretty much, but it still, has some vestiges here and there. The problem with this one is that it might be okay with this particular situation. It's hard to really determine. But when you weigh out all the facts that one of the first questions you have to ask yourself is, do I have all the facts? How do I know that I got them all? I mean, in other words, how if somebody's going to say, what are the consequences that would come out of me not saying anything if I work for Prudential? You can start making a list, but how do you know that you've really captured everything on that list? If you're going to put them on a scale, you have to have some idea of it. There's no way that you can know all those things. So it becomes very impractical and very difficult. It's not principled, right? So it has a practical point in the way that it can be applied, but it's not practical in a way that you never know exactly if you have all the instances that need to be weighed out, okay? But they probably would have not a huge issue with this particular scenario. Okay, so the last one that I want to talk about here is situational ethics. Now, situational ethics is another form of consequentialism. It was by a guy named Joseph Fletcher back in the 60s. So rather than saying we're going to work just for the greatest happiness of all people, he says we're going to work for what produces the greatest amount of love for everybody. Now, the problem with this is it doesn't define love. So we don't really know exactly what that means, and that's a very difficult idea to nail down. So we're still in the same type of dilemma here. Maybe somebody would define love as me taking care of my family and me making sure that I can provide for them financially, the house and everything else. So maybe this would be okay because I don't want to lose my job. So I'm going to, use love as a means to achieve that end. Well, how would you think that way, right? The point to all this is that it becomes very difficult for us to make an assessment on the spot. When I was younger, if you wanted to work out, okay, most people, steel weights just started to become popular, and like you all know, anybody know Lou Ferrigno? Arnold Schwarzenegger?
Yeah, Lewis the Hulk, right?
Lou's the Hulk. Good, Wally. I met the guy. I wrestled with him in my backyard, right? So my neighbor, Tony DeFrancisco, I lived in this little neighborhood, and back before Lou Ferrigno was the Hulk, he was a power lift. Well, he was a bodybuilder along with Arnold Schwarzenegger. So he came to judge a particular competition, and we sat in the backyard and actually wrestled. Like, I remember shaking his hand. I must have only been like 12 years old. I felt like I was putting like a little thimble inside like a big bear mitt. The guy was huge, right? But my point is physical exercise, although everybody kind of thought it was important, there weren't like the opportunities like you'd have today. So there might have been, like, there was one store near me called Fedorko's, and the family had a little extra money, so they bought some weights and benches and stuff, and they put them in the basement, and they charged us all like $5 a month or whatever, go down and use it. But that's all you had. Well, today, gyms are like the new churches. I mean, they're full. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, right? It's good that we're concerned with our physical health and how that attributes, but I often wonder what's the purpose of it. I mean, we're not just here to live longer. We should have our health should be for another cause. My point is this: could you imagine if we had some sort of clubs out there that helped us work through ethics and morality like we do gyms? I mean, that almost sounds funny if you say it, because people would say, well, that's kind of weird. But you could see where, where are our virtue gyms? There are none, right? So what happens is we take all this stuff basically on the fly. Whatever happens, we'll think about it then. But that reveals two things about us as a people, right? Is one, that we have to admit that if we don't really spend time thinking about it, reading about it, contemplating about it, or seeking answers, then we have to say we're pretty apathetic about it overall. That doesn't make us unethical. That just makes us apathetic. We don't quite, put it together, right? But the other side of the coin is it never allows us to escape the moral consequences of what we do. So we can argue back and forth about, well, I didn't know, but it could be you should have known. You should have thought about it. So those people that got fired from Prudential, I hope their children tell them, you're everything I want to be. I hope that's where that went, because you're principled, you stood on things. Rosa Parks, I know she wasn't the first, but it would have been easier for her to get off the bus. It had not. Her life would have went on. She wouldn't have had to put up the fight. There's always the people that will accept the easy path, but the ones that don't, the ones that, I'm going to be the one that stands out. And okay, Rosa Parks became famous, but these people at, Prudential, nobody knows the name. Fine. They're still heroes, right? So, we have to find a way to develop ethical systems within our own psyche on the same level that we would try to take care of ourselves in other ways physically, right? That type of thing. So before we move on and wrap this up, any questions on that? It's a real drive-by, but it's just a way to look at the various systems. Okay, so what it means then from, I'll speak directly from a Catholic moral point of view, obviously this is not only from that, right, is that if we're going to say that we have a mission for the world, our mission for the world is solidarity, is an interdependence. Solidarity is not that we're all connected. We are all connected. We're all interdependent. Nothing like this pandemic shows that more clearly, right? People start arguing about social distancing to miss the whole point. The idea is not to make sure you're 6 feet from somebody. The point is don't go anywhere. Because the fact of it is that you might be carrying something unbeknownst and bring it back to others, and this thing will grow exponentially, right? So if we could all just hunker down for whatever time it takes, we might be able to put a dent in this. That gives us a real clear description of exactly what it means, for us to be in solidarity. So mission solidarity then is this understanding that don't we all share the same hopes, all the same joys, all the same cares, all the same concerns? We're all worried about our families. We're all worried about our future. All the concerns that you and I have are shared. So, it's not enough to just simply say we're all in this together. It's like, how do we help each other through all these different things? And the ethical system, especially in economics, that's what we're trying to focus on. And economics, directly ties into all of that. All right. Participative theonomy. So theonomy be like ruled by God. Okay. But the human person, from a Catholic standpoint, is not ruled by God by some external force. This isn't about making a nation where, we have some Pope king. I would be absolutely opposed to that whatsoever. What this talks about is that God rules the human person from the interior, all right? And we participate through nature and grace in that reigning of God within us. So in other words, we should be the masters of ourselves and not try to be the masters of others. So we need to get our own selves in order. We need to be the most ethical people that we could possibly be, not just because we think it's a good thing, but because we know that somehow this is how we're participating in God's grace and nature, and then others benefit from this. So rather, again, this goes back to the prophet Michael Jackson, worry about the man in the mirror, right? You just change who you are and stop worrying so much about overthrowing economic systems, which is why I step back. I get a lot of grief from some of my academic friends, not at St. Joe's, but other places saying, you keep pressing that the individual has to change. But it takes more than that. We need to have change in society. Well, a company is not, even though it's a corporate person, it's not an entity by itself, right? There are individuals and human persons that run these. There's the CEO is a human person. The board of directors are human persons. People have stock, right? Sometimes people don't realize that the stock that they own is actually makes you an owner in a company, and therefore you are guilty for whatever they do. or be praised for what they do. You can't just simply say, well, I didn't know, I just own stock. Well, you're supposed to know. You bought stock. You should know what that company's doing, right? But these are all people. Could you imagine if one person at Prudential who had power just said, look, I understand this is going to cost us dearly, but those three people did the right thing. And if we had more people like them, we'd be a better company. I understand that we're going to lose money, but this company is not about making money. This company is about helping other individuals. Wouldn't we love that person, right? But see, nobody would buy that stock, would they? People would dump Prudential stock the next day once they heard that, which makes us go back to say, what system would fix that? How would a government official, I don't care who your president is at the time, I don't care, Obama, Trump, or whoever's coming next, they're never going to be able to step in and fix that. Congress will never be able to step in and fix that. They can put all the rules they want in place, and people who have power are going to find ways around the rules. But we have total control over our own actions. And in the end, right, I mean, your goal, my goal should only be, for the children that you'll have in the future, the ones I have, or just, nieces and nephews and friends that they come to you at the, towards the end of our life and say, you're a person of principle. You never, ever, conceded the things that you thought were true. Then you'd be a hero, right? Now that's within our power, but it takes, the same effort that we put towards our physical bodies as it would our psychological and spiritual bodies. All right. Okay. Now, with progress and development, if you read Sollicitudes Res Socialis, the document by John Paul II, we confuse these two things. We want to just, progress, and progression could be this, this incremental line. It's almost like a straight line that goes better and better and better. That's not the same as development. Development, has more to do, at least how we're using the context here, with the human person and becoming. Society is more suited to the human person. The human person is helping to, influence the society they live in. And development, unlike progress, is never just incremental, and it's never straightforward. There's always going to be this waning and waxing, almost like a wave going in and out. But we're trying to do better overall, which I think, sometimes you think with various issues with feminism or racial issues. I think development's a better way to look at that, because sometimes we go back and forth, but overall our trajectory is better. Progress is just, one thing after the other. Now, in economic terms, we have a hard time understanding progress in any other way anymore. For us, we might see technological progress, so we'll see things just have to get better. Instruments have to get smaller and faster and more intuitive in their use. And economics, things just have to get better and better. So the question, are you better off than your parents? If you're not better off than your parents, why not? Well, I think I've said before, at some point, can't we just ask the question, is enough enough? How much does a person really need? If you grew up in a house that had 3 bedrooms and 2 baths, and there's only 3 of you, what do you need? A house with 4 bedrooms and 4 baths? I mean, at some point we have adequate housing, we have adequate lifestyles, and that should be fine. There's no problem with plateauing, right? So nonetheless, there's always a distinction. And, the Sermon on the Mount really hits this home. So the Sermon on the Mount, the reason why that's known as the new law, is supposed to reorient the way that we look at things. So all of a sudden now, we have to understand that if somebody has, less than us, we have an obligation to help them. And it's not because it's some rule that's imposed from the outside. It's not even from a particular ethic. We might use natural law ethic, but it's an understanding that that person is in need like we are in need, and they're another one of us. So it comes from a different place, right? And the document goes on to say that, we're in this trajectory where we're not hoarders, right? So, I mean, sometimes I know on TV, there's that TV show Hoarders, where everybody's piling more and more on. We're really not hoarders. We're consumers. We want the next thing. You see when a new iPhone comes out, how many people scramble for it. Imagine if people were content. I mean, one thing, they probably would still come out with something new. But they would probably just simply, it'd be less, it'd cost less, I can tell you that, because it wouldn't create such a frenzy and such. So we want the next thing. We get over concerned with not how much we have, but our focus becomes on what we don't have. And then somehow the satisfaction is always seen to be in what we don't have. So we go for that next, right? And that brings us to this other point, is that if you can imagine a horizon is like some kind of event or a place where you can reach, right? So we can't, if we look at like the horizon of, the Earth, you never reach it because every time you start moving along, the horizon keeps moving past us. If we start to look at our material satisfaction in the same way, and this is what's being made in this cyclical, then that's exactly what's happening. We're never going to be satisfied because whatever we think the next thing is that's going to bring us some sort of fulfillment, we know never does. I mean, we knew that as young people with Christmas presents. Much as we couldn't wait to have something, within 3 or 4 weeks, it wasn't as important to us anymore. Well, that never changes as we become adults. As we become adults, now we become overly concerned with what we don't have. The whole idea that the grass is greener. But the reality is once we're there, it doesn't bring the satisfaction we want. So we can never reach that horizon. So we're constantly trying to consume more. And that's how we're interpreting the economic sphere. So this, in other words, if we lived probably under very strict Christian principles, and I'm not saying this in a prideful way, the economy would probably collapse in a week because people would not be buying. I'm not here to tout my own horn, but I'm not commuting. Outside of me not commuting, this is really not affecting me whatsoever. Me and my family, we don't purchase things. My wife lives, we try to live in voluntary poverty. We don't buy new clothing. We don't buy new furniture. We don't buy new anything. We just buy the food that we need, and that's about it. So this isn't a big burden for us. We can't go out and about like we may like to go out and about, but that has nothing to do with buying things per se, right? And I said before, back in 2008, when the Great Recession hit, the joke was in my family, my daughters were young. I said, somebody better call Grammy Bujno and tell her that we're in a recession because she wouldn't even know. This is a woman who wouldn't even throw half of her water back into the sink because she would save it, right? She'd put a saran wrap over top unfinished glass of water with a rubber band, and she saved it for later. So when you live very simply, or if you're even self-sustaining, right, all of a sudden you're not consuming, but you're also more satisfied because you're not trying to seek satisfaction in things that won't help. Unlike eating, right? I mean, sometimes we get pretty hangry, and when we get hangry, we start grabbing whatever's close to us. And if it's, sugary or if it's carbohydrates, it seems to fill the void, but not for very long, right? So everything else kind of fits into the same, same scenario. So here's a quote that all of us experience firsthand the sad effects of this blind submission to pure consumerism. First place, a crass materialism, and at the same time, a radical dissatisfaction, because we quickly learn that one is shielded from the flood of publicity, unless one is shielded from the flood of publicity and ceaselessness, tempting offers of products. The more one possesses, the more one wants. The deeper aspirations remain unsatisfied, even stifled. So what's really great, I told my one daughter when she started taking logic in her philosophy program, I said, when you start to learn about fallacies and everything else, you're never going to be sold something you don't need. You're going to see through every sort of technique that tries to make a pitch to you. And you're no longer just going to be titillated, right? Like, oh, wouldn't that be really cool? You're going to start evaluating it rationally and come to the point that I don't need it. And again, I'm not saying this that I hope it hurts people, but if people only bought what they truly needed, the economy would stop. Now, there's nothing wrong with wanting things, all right? We started out by somebody saying the distinction between want and needing. That's great. So it's not a problem with wanting things. It's not even a problem with having things that you want. It's a problem with considering those things that you want as needs, and therefore they become part and parcel of what we try to do. So you think of how many people work long hours to live in houses, to go on vacations, to eat at restaurants that we don't really need to do. And then if we all scaled down, it would free up time, which probably, if we do this correctly, we would spend time with each other and not with pursuing things that never satisfy us in the beginning. Because, the old joke that no hearse has a hitch on the back where you can bring your stuff with you, nobody at the end of their life says, I wish I'd have worked more. Nobody says that. They always everything becomes very relational, and they say, I wish I'd have spent more time with my spouse. I wish I'd have spent more time with my children. I wish I would have spent more time just walking in grass. Little things like this. It may sound very silly, especially if you're young. When I was young, I probably would have chuckled at this. But I tried to listen to people that were old and find out, like, what is it that they miss? And it was things like my mother said, she misses walking through fields. Because when you get older, you can't always walk where you want. You have to make sure you're on smooth surfaces, right? You may not have rugs around because they can be trip factors. So, like, I have a hill in my yard, so I don't come up the lane. I try to walk up through the grass and the trees or whatever, right? Because I'm thinking one day I'm not going to be able to do this. And that always sounds silly, and it sounds kind of corny. But if we start to look at value in certain things that are absolutely free, we're going to find more satisfaction in those, and we're going to be less consumers. And again, I realize that'll affect the economy, but it'll help us as individuals. So the document on to say that we have to have this distinction between being and having, right? If we only evaluate who we are in terms of the things that we have, we never quite can ever aspire to that which we should be. Okay, so we can't confuse these two things. And I'd like to see everybody grow up someday, including myself, to be honest, genuine, caring individuals. And if you could do that with material things around you, then God bless. But if you find that those material things are actually in the way of all the relational aspects of your life, then make the hard decision and choose the best of the two, right? And the argument then within the document is that, we can't use things with impunity. I mean, being has to do with everything from grass, trees, to anything that exists has being, right? So we can't even use all these things with impunity. And we also have to realize on the second aspect is that resources are limited. There's only so much of this stuff is out there. So especially as individuals who are saying they were very concerned about the environment, I'm always trying to do from an educating point of view and not from a convicting point of view. Well, maybe from a convicting point of view, but not from a judgmental point of view. But I want to see more young people not just embrace the idea of the effects of global climate change, but live in a way that's going to actually fix it. Live simply. You don't need to go on fancy vacations. You don't need to even go on things on spring break. You can just basically, go to the local lake or whatever and spend some time there. Don't buy what you don't need. Don't go out to eat if you don't have to go out to eat. If you start limiting, and don't drive where you have to drive, right? When you start thinking about how much that we physically can do ourselves, then all of a sudden it's no longer the government's concern. Yeah, the government can put things together. I understand that. But the factories that they're trying to put regulations on are only running because of the things that we want to consume. We miss that we're the ones that are driving the need, and all they're trying to do is fill the need. And the only reason that the need is created in us through advertising. I mean, so it's almost like this vicious circle, and a person who is truly at peace with themselves just walks out and says, I'm fine. What I have is sufficient. And all of a sudden, it's kind of a cool thing, right? Anyway. And development is not without consequence, right? So even as we are developing, it may not be a straight line trajectory, it's going to affect things. It's going to affect our relationship with each other. It's going to reflect our relationship with all of creation. So we can't pretend that simply having the next thing, getting the next iPhone is not an ethical decision. It becomes an ethical decision. I know that our hands are forced. We're going to talk about phones per se. At some point I had a iPhone 5 and it wasn't updating anymore. I mean, you get to a point where things don't get updated, and phones aren't just luxuries anymore. We use them for all kinds of things, right? There are newspapers, there are alarm clocks, there are email and all that types of things. So they have brought on a greater function. I don't think you can just them as unnecessary, but we don't need every last gadget that comes through the earth, right? That type of thing. All right. Let's see what else is here. So the document then says, today, perhaps more than the past, the intrinsic contradiction of a development limited only to economic element is seen more clearly. Such development easily subjects the human person and his deepest needs to the demands of economic planning and selfish profit. In other words, maybe we should start asking ourselves harder questions from an economic sphere. How do we develop as human person? So there's this is almost Kantian, but it's a Catholic principle that the economy exists for the human person. The human person does not exist for the economy. So yes, I understand they're intertwined, that the better that we can do as individuals, if the economy grows and everybody benefits from that. We also know the disparity that grows, right? If you watch anything on the news, there's always that stock market ticker that constantly goes across the bottom. But yet we find out that 20% of the people own 80% of the stock. So what do those numbers mean to most people? The stock market crashes. I don't think that's a good thing. I don't wish it on anybody. But if you don't own stock, you didn't lose anything. Okay, you didn't gain anything either. I understand how the whole thing works. I'm not trying to oversimplify this. But the reality is that, like you think we're in a health crisis now. So we're starting to focus on what's important in our lives, aren't we? What's important in our lives are the people sitting next to us. Yes, the economy is connected to that, but it's not, the individual's not dependent on that. So I have another friend who they live in a Dorothy Day, they created a Catholic workers farm. And I was talking to her just the other day, telling her how I'm not really affected by any of this. She goes, neither are we. She goes, we live here, and she goes, I teach online anyway, and we don't purchase anything that we don't need. We try to grow whatever we can for ourselves. And she goes, so this really is pretty much just same life. The only thing that's different is we can't go into public spheres for the sake of others. But once you take that away, it hasn't really changed any life. That's kind of cool, you know. I mean, if you want, um, you know, there's an old song that freedom is just another word for nothing left to lose, right? You guys, any songs from the 70s? So it's a real sense of freedom when you can't take anything away from you. So again, just something to think about, especially in economic terms. So in the end, we should know that we're not only subject to biological laws, says the document, but also to moral ones. So we're in a situation now, and this was written 30, 40 years ago. There are a few who possess much who don't really succeed in being because they're hindered by the cult of having, while there are many others who have very little or nothing, and they're never able to realize their basic human vocation because they're deprived of essential goods. So if we want to create justice in the world, and we're going to try to do it through these economic means, we have to determine how we're participating in the economy. And how we're participating in the economy doesn't mean that we simply, we have all our purchases become ethical choices, to be honest, right? And sometimes you're forced in a choice, but other times we're quite, how do you want to say, we're quite implicated in the way that we try to live our lifestyle. And then it's easy for us to say that somebody else has a bigger house than us, somebody else goes on vacations than us. But if there's one thing that I've learned from just people that I love very much, friends, as I've seen them, do better in economic prosperity, what you see is that the houses get bigger, the cars get nicer, the vacations get farther away, more exotic, and more often. Now, nobody's ever saying, and the Catholic Church is not saying anybody is stealing any of that money that they use for that fund. But is that what we consider important? And how, I watched the documentary yesterday on Dorothy Day, and he couldn't understand how somebody could have more than they need when other people don't have what they need. And she would live almost in abject poverty to make sure that she gave whatever she had. And she said, look, if I have enough money for one day to make, if soup's going to cost 50 cents and I have $10, then I can feed 20 people. And rather than me take $5 and only feed, people out of the 15, she goes, I'm going to feed everybody and I'm going to take the same share that they have. That's totally voluntary. That's not socialism, right? That's totally voluntary. First thing, I'm going to try to do the best I can. But her goal is that she saw a real economic injustice. So anyway, what do you think about all this? Any comments, any questions?